Hi, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you today with my dear colleague, Arnaud Delorum. And we are going to talk about a set of 3 studies we conducted looking at psi, replication, and expectancy effects. And I want to acknowledge that this was an international collaboration. We engaged people in a variety of labs, and our goal was to really look at this gnarly issue of replication in science generally and in psi research in particular. And we know that replication is a very thorny issue, and it's not just in psi research that researchers are struggling to understand, to even the very process of asking questions a second time is often not engaged with. And so what we're seeing in mainstream psychology, for example, is that there is a failure of replication. It's also happening in the biomedical sciences where people are simply not able to replicate. And so we are trying to tackle that question in the context of this set of studies. So next slide, please. So we did a study together trying to replicate Daryl Bem's Feeling the Future. And in particular, this is a study that became very renowned. It was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and it became the focus of replication attempts all over the world. And Bem originally found with 100 subjects that he had odds of 1 in 10,000. And this really captivated a global imagination, a mainstream psychologist attempting to do psi research and publishing a paper in which he had very clearly found evidence for precognition. Next slide, please. So this is just a short video of the way in which we designed these studies. We took Bem's experiment looking at reaction time, and we were interested in whether people's reaction time was faster or slower when they found congruence between the picture they saw and the word. So in this case, it would be an incongruent. He found that participants are faster when they're congruent. So when you see something like love and this beautiful polar bear, at least for some people, that induces a quicker reaction time because it's congruent. So in the Bem studies, he reversed the classic paradigm. And instead of showing the matched picture in real time, he showed it in the future. And so the goal was to see if you could have the same kind of effect where there'd be congruence or incongruence, and we could measure their reaction time to that. So it's looking really at kind of our unconscious beliefs. It's a process that's been used pretty extensively, looking at biases and, kind of below the threshold of conscious awareness, beliefs and activities. Okay, so next slide, please. One after that. There we go. So, ultimately people perform better or worse based on their expectations and the expectations of others. And this is a classic paradigm. Robert Rosenthal really pioneered this idea of expectancy effects. He looked at the idea that when people feel that they are going to do better, they do better. And he really was able to study this, and the project is something that seems quite replicable in terms of mainstream psychology. So we were really interested in tackling that question of whether there'd be a correlation in the outcomes of the psi experiment in relationship to this reaction time. And so we can go to the next slide, please. So we were looking at 3 studies. There was this idea that we would look at just the regular self-reported nature of their beliefs in psi. We looked at this both at the experimenter level and at the participant level. So the way the studies were designed is that we recruited collaborators from across the world who were the experimenters, or who helped us to recruit experimenters from their students. And we had, in this particular first study, 512 participants. And we were looking at how their self-reported belief would correlate with the decision time. Okay, next. Study 2, we went a little deeper, and Arno will talk with you about the results that we found in these various experiments. But in study 2, we were looking at whether we could sort of shift or bias people's belief in psi. And we did this by priming them. And we had different kinds of primes, whether it was pro-psi or anti-psi. And we looked to see if, in doing that, if people were reading the anti-psi, would they have lower success at the psi experiment and vice versa. Next slide, please. This third study was looking at implicit beliefs and whether, when people report what they believe, is that what shows up when you look at their unconscious. And so this looked at this implicit belief paradigm and whether or not it would correlate with both their self-report on belief and their outcomes on the psi experiments. Next slide, please. And I think, Arno, this is where you pick up.
Thank you, Marilyn. So I'm going to detail a little bit each of these experiments and what we found in these experiments, and then Marilyn will come back to wrap up at the end. So this is the first one, and so these experiments also, Marilyn didn't mention, they took, I think, over 6 years. So it wasn't done in a day. It was a huge project. And for this experiment, we would use exactly the same program that Daryl Bem had done. We were on several collaboration with them. So this is really a true replication of what he did. We only added a twist, which was we had a questionnaire about the belief in psi to see if this influenced the outcome. But otherwise, it was just a standard replication of his experiment. The other difference is that we have many more subjects. In his original experiment, he only had 100. Here we had 512. And each group, we also had 32 experimenters all around the world. So as Marilyn mentioned, this was an international collaboration. So we found collaborators all around the world. We sent them the program. We trained them to use the program, and each of them run 16 subjects and then sent us back the data for analysis. Each of the subject, the participant did 40 trials, as in the original experiment. I think they did a little bit more because in the original experiment it was just 20, but we thought of increasing it. And so the other difference is that we registered the experiment, we pre-registered the experiment. So pre-registration means that we send it to, in this case, the KPU registry, and they store it. So this is all the methods of how we're going to collect the data and how we're going to analyze the data. So we can't go back and change that later. And this is done even before we start collecting the data. And this is the analysis of our results. So this is the replication of the Bem experiment. And in his experiment, he actually, so we measured the reaction time of people. And basically, we want to know, are they faster when after the response, the word is congruent with the picture or not? And you also have technicalities in which you look at different cutoff. For example, you can ignore the very slow reaction times, or you can include them. So you had different cutoffs. And so we did exactly the same analysis. And we also do some transformation of response time. And the reason is that you apply the statistics. You can't just apply the statistics on reaction time. You apply the statistics on the inverse of reaction time or on the logarithmic of the reaction time. And as in the original study of Daryl Bem, we also had different cutoff. So when we did this analysis, and so we had 3 hypotheses. This is the first one, trying to reproduce the Bem original paper. Then the second hypothesis is that participants with positive expectations, those we thought they were going to do really well in the task, would have larger psi effect. And we had the same hypothesis for experimenter. When experimenter had large expectation, we made the hypothesis that the participants in the task they were running would do better at the task. And also we run some additional analysis. I'm going to talk about that. So sometimes you need to look at life from a different perspective, because in the previous, so in the BEM the replication, we didn't find any obvious effect, and we didn't find effect either in the participant expectation and the experimenter expectation. So, but we run some additional analysis in which we only considered, for example, the English-speaking individuals, because we translated the task in 5 different languages. And when we only considered people who took the test in English, we found some significant results, likelihood of 1 in 33. So it's not as convincing as the original study, but still. And we also run some single trial analysis in which, instead of just considering one value per participant, so their mean reaction time, mean difference between congruent versus non-congruent, we did every single one of their trial. And when we did that, we also found a significant effect in the expected direction. So although it wasn't a true replication, it was promising. So then we run this second analysis in which not only we had the belief in psi, but we try to influence people's belief. And so the design is very similar to the previous one. We also had 32 experimenters. These were different than from the previous experiment. And we had each of them have 20 subjects. So we tried to increase the number of subjects. So here we have 640 compared to 512 in the first iteration. And we also submitted it to the for pre-registration. So we also already fixed all the analysis before we run the experiment. And in this one, we also added the analysis of the results we found in the previous one. So we registered the English analysis of English-speaking participants and single trial analysis. This is the type of priming that people got. So the priming for experimenters were videos, and this was a few minutes of video from Daryl Bem talking about his experiment and claiming the results were very convincing and positive. Or we had this PhD student, Samuel Malton, who was trying to deconstruct Daryl results. And so experimenters saw either of these videos, and this was blinded to us. We didn't know which one they saw. I didn't know which one I saw. The administrative assistant knew which one. The one issue, by the way, in running these experiments is that the people who saw this video, a lot of them dropped. So we had a lot of hard time finding people to do the experiments if they thought it was not going to work, because then they got discouraged. And then the participants also had some priming when they're doing the task. The reason they didn't have exactly the same priming is that the video takes some time, 2 or 3 minutes, and the task is very quick. It's only about 10 minutes. And also it was technically challenging to put the video in the program that Daryl had made. So we just gave them some text, which is either an excerpt from Rupert Sheldrake and with all his credentials, or an excerpt from a skeptic. And so both experimenter and participants got some priming, and it was all randomized. And our hypotheses were similar to the one in the previous experiment. First, we wanted to reproduce the result that Daryl found, and then also the result that we found in the first experiment. Then we also had, as in the first experiment, the hypothesis that positive expectation of participants, so this is just the questionnaire they fill out, would lead to larger side effects, and then same for experimenters. And then we also had the hypothesis that positive priming would lead to larger side effect, and same for experimenter. And so we didn't find any effect of the expectation or the priming. We observed the trend actually in the standard analysis of Daryl Bem. I think the p-value was about 0.08. So it wasn't significant, but at least it was in trend the right direction. And the English participants, now, when we only consider the English participants, it didn't reproduce the result of the first experiment. And the single trial analysis wasn't significant, but the trend was also in the same direction. Then we ran a first study. And in the first study, in addition to testing people's explicit belief, so when they fill out the questionnaire, they have to say how much do you believe this is going to work, and how much do you believe in psi. We also ran an implicit task. And the implicit task is they see words, and they have to provide association between words, and we measure their reaction time. So we have an implicit measure of their beliefs. And the idea is that our hidden iceberg, in some sense, that our explicit belief can be the top of the iceberg, and then we're trying to probe up the bigger part by probing the unconscious. And let me give you an example of the type of association people were doing. So they had, for example, to press a button when they saw either words about psi or word about good or real, and they had to press a button when this word about psi and a negative word like unreal or bad, and then we measured the reaction time difference. So that gives an indication of their implicit belief. And so the hypothesis this time, so there was no priming, but the hypotheses were the same as the first two previous experiments for number 1, number 2, and number 3. And then for number 4, we thought that participant implicit expectation would lead to larger psi, and positive experimenter implicit, the experimenter also did the implicit test, would lead to larger psi. And so we didn't find any of these expectation or implicit belief. And so in the replicating the Daryl Bem study, we found a trend in the opposite direction. And same thing for single trial analysis, we found a trend in the opposite direction. Now, something has to be said about this task is that this one we didn't use the Daryl Bem software. We programmed the software online because we thought it would be easier to collect data. So the software looked exactly the same, but the delivery was different. So there was a lot of difference between experiment 1 and 2 and experiment 3, which you could claim could influence the results that we obtained. We also tried some secondary analysis, such as the effect of the experimenter on the influence of belief. We didn't find any effect, but we did find a very strong correlation between implicit and explicit belief. So this is when we're doing the task and we're looking at the reaction time association of unconscious, and when we're filling the questionnaire. So basically, if they have a strong belief in psi, their reaction time on the word is going to be consistent with that strong belief. And this was extremely significant. What we also did is that we prepared the data for other people to analyze. So it's available online. And so we have documentation, how the data is released, and we have the data for experimenter 1, experimenter 2, and experimenter 3. And so you can download the data and we analyze it. It's a lot of data. There's 96 experimenter. There's 1,536 participants, plus 434 additional ones. So these were participants that did the task, but they did it they were either additional participants or there was a problem. Sometimes you only did part of the task. We also ran a global analysis where we put all the data together. And we found with this global analysis, no effect of participant expectation, no effect of experimenter expectation, no effect when looking at English, and a trend in the expected direction when looking at single trials. We also looked at other types of analysis. For example, we used the Fisher method that combines extreme value probabilities from each test into one test using one formula. And what we found is that based on the number of trials we include, we can actually get a very strong effect. So there's a lot more into this data and how to analyze that data. And so this is why we put it online. So now I'm going to give it back to Marilyn, so she can conclude.
Thank you, Arno. So it was a massive amount of work, and it involved a lot of goodwill and what is considered now to be adversarial science, because we recruited experimenters who were both pro and con the psi hypothesis. So we were really engaging a broad population, and you'll see we have completed 2 publications on the work. The first was studies 1 and 2, which we published in the SSE journal. And on this, we list all of our co-experimenters, and there were many. Thank you all. And then we also published study 3 in the journal F1000, which is an online open source journal. So people have access to that without a membership. Next slide, please. So by way of conclusion, in many ways, this was a success. The idea that you could bring so many people from different countries, different languages together, and to share the participation in a large experiment was magnificent, and we are very glad to have had that participation. We did a systematic study of the relationship between expectancies and psi outcomes, looking both at experimenter effects as well as participant effects, and did not find a replication of the Bem study. We did find a strong correlation between the explicit and the implicit beliefs in psi, which Arno went into detail about. But ultimately, we had a failed replication of the original Bem studies. We worked with Daryl and had a delightful connection with him, and we really gave it our all. So there is something very complex about psi, and the whole issue of replication still needs to be unpacked. But we do feel we gave it our best shot, and we think that there was a lot of generativity that came out of this. So last slide, please. Thank you for your attention. Thank you so much to the Be All Foundation for their ongoing support and their courage and leadership. Thank you.